there, Banditos. Welcome to the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah. And today with us, we have Chris Ryall. You may know Chris as the former head honcho of IDW Publishing. Of course, they did a number of licensed books such as Transformers, Star Trek, Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe. Those all combined in a crossover you may have heard of in 2011 called Infestation. But you may not know Chris's humbler origin stories as the main writer on moviepoopshoot.com, which is a site that kind of grew out of one of those Kevin Smith films. But then he did make his way to IDW, where not only was he an editor, but also a writer. He did quite a few adaptations like Shaun of the Dead, Land of the Dead, Beowulf, Clive Barker's The Great, and Secret Show. But he also did a number of creator-owned comics. Probably the one you may be most familiar with is Zombies versus Robots, but he also did Groom Lake, The Colonized, The Hollows. So a really big wealth of creative energy out of Chris, and we get into it all, his whole career and what he's doing now. So let's get to it. This is Chris Ryall. Thanks for being here.
Hey, great. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, let's dive in. Our first question is our usual first question, which is, how did you first discover comic books?
So I was like 4 years old, and I was living in Long Beach, California, and some older neighbors down, like my older brother's friends down the street, had this comic collection, and I would go over there every now and then, and I found they had this real old copy of it was like Fantastic Four 130. I remember because they had this Jim Steranko cover of like the Fantastic Four fighting the Frightful Four, and it was just like, it was mind-blowing with all there's a guy made of sand and a stretchy guy and a guy on fire and this big rocky guy, and I was drawn to it immediately. And so I would go to their house all the time to read this thing. And then finally I got tired of having to go to their house. So one time on my way home, I just kind of took it with me. And that was sort of my entry to comics. My older brother was a big comic fan, and so he got me into him reading that way. This book right here, this copy of Fantastic Four, is actually the first comic I ever bought with my own like allowance money or something. So
Nice.
yeah, they kind of just been a big part of my life for my entire life.
That's let's comment on the sweet spinner rack you have behind you. That's a nice purchase. And yeah, we usually follow up with, do you have any of those first issues? So you do. You've managed to hang on to them for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I even still have the copy of Fantastic Four 130, the one that I took from my neighbors. And I mean, it's pretty shredded, but he reconnected with me through social media a few years ago, just out of the blue. So I was like, hey, man, I got to fess up to some decades old crime, and I still got the comic if you want it back. And he's like, couldn't be happier that it found a good home, and it seems like it set you on your way. So no, all good. So that was good, because I didn't want to give it back, but I would have.
That's amazing, and what a gracious neighbor you have.
I don't think he'd ever noticed or thought about it again.
Right.
For me, it was just like this
holy grail,
photo,
Yeah. So you had an interest in comics, early on, like many of us do. How did you then parlay that into a professional career? From what I can see from your biography, the first sort of entry point was through Kevin Smith. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'd always wanted to write comics, and I just never knew how. I always figured that if I didn't live in New York, you hear the stories of everybody just dropping by the bullpen and getting jobs at Marvel that way. And I'm like, well, I'm, in Nowheresville, Southern California. I have no chance of breaking into comics. And so I just thought, well, let me do things that are kind of tangentially connected to comics. And so I was writing reviews just for this little website called Comic Book Galaxy. Through that, I got to know Kevin Smith a bit. He actually took exception to a review I wrote of the Green Arrow comic that he did with Phil Hester. And I read the first issue, and I didn't totally get it, because it was like, I don't know if you ever read the comic, but it was like they pulled a Green Arrow forward in time. And so he was sort of talking like this character out of time, but you didn't know that in issue one. And so anyway, that's a little deep on the story itself, but I didn't really love the comic. And so I sort of said why it didn't work for me. And tonally, I thought the character felt really dated. And So Kevin saw that, dropped me a line, and sort of told me how wrong I was. And we just started like communicating back and forth here and there. And then eventually it turned into him contacting me and saying, "Hey, I'm going to be in LA." This was before he moved to LA. Um, and so we met up, saw the first Spider-Man movie. So I guess that would have been what, 2002. Um, and afterwards, we were just talking about work, and he said, I've got this website that was in one of my movies, but I want to turn it into a legitimate thing. It's always been this like Ain't It Cool News parody site called Movie Poop Shoot, but I want it to be a legitimate portal for, I don't know, movie news and TV and comics and stuff. And so then I just started writing multiple columns a week for that, writing other, I don't know, comic related pieces, bringing in other comic talent, interviewing comic people. And so that all of that through that website was what kind of led me to getting to know Steve Niles, who was really the catalyst for making IDW aware of me and having them contact me about the editor-in-chief job when they had an opening in early 2004.
Yeah, I'd love to know, that connection as well. So you were working on this website for Kevin Smith, which was, I don't know how you would describe it. It was mostly sort of reviews, right? Sort of, would you call it, I guess, journalism in a certain way? So like,
yeah, we were trying to play it straight because we figured we were already saddled with this goofy name, but we wanted legitimacy just so we could go to things like film premieres and I don't know, like so I would treat the reviews and everything legitimately, and not use it the way it was in the movie, which was just, like I say, a very sort of sarcastic, ain't it cool news kind of parody. So we played it as straight as we could, and we had fun with it, but definitely the reviews were not out to just talk trash or anything like that. They were all very fair and considered, and so I don't know, it became a pretty legitimate place despite the name, and so more and more comic creators wanted to get involved. And so one of those I talked to was Steve Niles, who originally, reached out and also said, "Hey, you guys have never talked about my Spawn book." He was doing, I think it was Hellspawn or Spawn the Dark Ages. And so he sent me a bunch of those and I reviewed them and we got friendly with one another. And then through all of that, Marvel contacted us. It was probably 2002, 2003, when they were trying to bring back the Epic Comics line. Sorry, this timeline's impossible to follow. I'm jumping all over the place, but but Marvel was bringing back Epic, and so they wanted sort of people who were tangentially connected to comics, but who hadn't actually written comics to any great degree to write scripts for them. So they brought in me. I brought in Steve to co-write with me, and so we pitched them on this Machine Man story that they bought and were going to make their lead title, and then it all just kind of collapsed under its own. I don't know, I don't know what the inner workings were, but our thing just kind of fell apart. But through that, got to know Steve real well, and we've been friends ever since. And so, like a year later, he contacted me and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about working for a publisher? IDW's editor-in-chief, Jeff Marriott, is leaving, and so there's an opening. I thought you'd be great for it." And so I said, "I've never thought about working on it from the inside. I figured I'd be like everybody else, try to write up comic pitches and mail them off and hope for the best." And so yeah, I came down and talked to IDW. I was living in LA at the time; they were in San Diego, and so it necessitated like a big move. Packing up everything and coming south and coming down and taking the job. But it sounded great, and so yeah, I jumped at the chance.
It sounds to me like, and maybe it didn't to you, obviously, since you took the job, but like a big change considering you were coming from. I know you were writing stories, right? And you were getting ready to pitch and try to become a writer, but
they were going nowhere.
I
tried some. Like my only Marvel paycheck at the time was a kill fee for Machine Man, and so it wasn't like I was on the cusp of anything at that point. And so it was certainly daunting, the idea of working, especially in that kind of key role at a publisher. But also, I was editor-in-chief at the website with Kevin, and so there was a lot of the same responsibilities, like just, we made sure we had new content and material up every single day of the site for the entire time I was there. And so it was like meeting deadlines, hiring people, sort of going through and editing people's pieces and all that. So it it was probably better experience for the IDW role than my full-time job at the time, which was like I was a copywriter at an ad agency. But I think the website job is the one that sort of got me better equipped to handle just all the demands of doing monthly comics.
Yeah. I mean that makes sense. Yeah, I was going to sort of draw the distinction between, being an editor in chief for more like article based,
Mm.
publication, if you will, even though it was online, versus a story or fiction driven,
Yeah.
entity. Was there any, adjustments that you felt like you had to make, or was it just the basic underlying foundations were the same? And you were just now working with, fictional stories rather than
Oh no, I had
articles and
no
such.
idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to like work with production people to get books done. I had no like Niles and maybe a couple other people that I met like on Brian Bendis's message board or something were my only contacts. Like I had no talent pool to pull from, and at that point, IDW was doing 4 regular covers and an incentive cover. So like on I don't know CSI or Angel books like that, I had to come up with 5 covers every month, and so it was, yeah, I had no idea what I was doing. So pretty much anybody who sent me in samples, if they were halfway decent, I was like, yeah, you should do covers for us, and so it was completely a learn on the fly kind of thing. Jeff Marriott, the outgoing editor in chief, was living in San Diego at the time, but he was just about to move to Arizona. So I had like a week transition where I could call him up in a panic and be like, "How do I do this? How do I balloon a book for lettering? How do I?" And so I had him for a few days of to coach me, and then after that he was gone. It was just like, all right, well, I just got to figure this out because like once you start on the monthly comic pace, it's really relentless. So you gotta just figure out what you're doing and not there's no time to really delay or think too much.
I mean, that sounds absolutely insane, to tell you the truth. Not to have that backstop only for a week and then just you're in it. You're in the deep end.
Yeah, and I
I
mean I was the only editor at the time. So I was editor in chief, but also the only editorial staff. So it was me and the publisher, Ted Adams, were the ones who kind of figured out what we wanted to do. And at the same time, like we're keeping the main books going. I was also started writing. I wrote Shaun of the Dead for the company. It was my first published book. And then I was also pitching on other, like we were trying to develop more licensed titles. So that was,
mhm.
back at Rhode Island over and over pitching Hasbro on the Transformers license, which was available. And so, yeah, it was a lot and it always remained a lot, but you kind of settle into a rhythm of just figuring out how to, I don't know, try to keep every possible ball in the air.
You had did you have you didn't have anything to compare it to in terms of working
Right.
at a publisher before. So what was your sense of IDW coming in terms of how it ran, but also did you even have time or like bandwidth to think about like what you wanted, what the vision was for IDW as it grew? Or were you just kind of
Um,
like, let's just try to get this machine continuing to run?
Yeah, it was like, or trying not to break the machine that they'd already built. But it was, I mean, I knew of them through 30 Days of Night. Like, I actually bought 30 Days of Night at the comic
Yeah.
store, and I knew that they were this tiny little horror publisher, but I didn't know anything beyond that. And so when I came in, it was largely horror titles. 30 Days kind of just kickstarted this entire horror line of books by Steve Niles and others. And then there was just a very few licensed titles. So it was like 24 and CSI were already going, and then at Angel, like we had, or they had just signed Angel to continue that one after the TV show ended. But then beyond that, it was yeah, just figuring out like, all right, what do I want to do now? And so one of the things I wanted was to just not only be a horror publisher because I figured this is great right now, but I've been around comics long enough and read enough comics that you start to limit yourself because audiences come and go. And so if you don't, I don't know, have a wider swath of books, eventually people have sort of had their fill of horror titles and want something else. And so that's when we started thinking, well, if we do things like the Transformers, and then going after other titles as well, it just felt like we'd be smart to really just diversify the types of books we were making at the time.
Yeah. I mean, that makes an awful lot of sense. And, what you eventually got into and you've been referencing all along the way has been a lot of licensed books, right? Had you had any, I don't know, experience about what it would be like? Obviously, you didn't have a lot to work on comic books in general, but then to work on licensed book where there is this, third person, third cook in the kitchen, which is the licensor, if I'm getting
Yeah.
that right. Um, what was your impression of that, and how was it to work with all of these licensors in terms of making stories and publishing books?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, like it's funny, you always heard horror stories, that like I don't know, the GI Joe comics back in the 80s were just there to sell toys, and like whenever Hasbro was making a new figure, they would call it Marvel and say, "Put this character in next month because we need to sell toys."
Right.
And I don't know if that was ever true or just one of those apocryphal kind of stories, but we never experienced that. Like we sort of went in there as the complete unknown. Like I remember one of the people on the Hasbro side going, why are we talking to you? Like, we don't know what IDW is. Like, we know who the big publishers that are pitching us are. And so why are you even in this conversation? And so it was like a real challenge just to sell them on why we were the right choice over, much bigger and more established shops. But the way we approached it, like then and all the way through, was always like, there's got to be a champion for the book. You like, if you enter into any of these things because you just think it's going to be a cash grab or something, like, I don't know. Feel like readers are savvy enough to know when you don't care. And so, I read a lot of licensed books back when I was a kid that weren't very good. I mean, even Star Wars kind of had its peaks and valleys and more valleys and things like that. And so you always got a sense that like the big publishers put their top talent understandably on their characters, and
Right.
so X-Men and Spider-Man and Batman were always getting the top creators, and then the licensed stuff would get whoever was available or something like that. And so I always wanted to approach like we don't have that many titles that are our own. So if we treat these with the importance and the care and respect that we would treat as if we owned Transformers or Angel or anything else, then that should translate to the readers. Like hopefully the our passion will, be a thing that they also feel passionate about. And so that was always the core of all of them, is just like we got to find the thing that we love about these. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it because then it just becomes an anchor, then you're just, I don't know, licensed titles are never for 6 months. They're always for 3 years or 5 years. And so if you don't like it becomes a real grind over years. And so we've just always tried to have that be our driving force, was like, if we like it, then that's the first good step toward, pursuing it.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I've always said in a lot of these interviews, you can tell when people like what they're doing and like the characters they're working on and like the books that they're on, because it comes through on the page. And when it's just not there, it's like, just like movies, TV, and acting. You can
Yeah.
tell when someone's sort of phoning it in. So that makes a lot of sense that you really have to have some sort of attachment with the property in order to do books that, have some passion to them, so to speak.
The other thing was, I mean, the nice thing, it was sort of before social media became this whole thing, but like message board culture was all big at the time. And so
Right.
I would just like I spent months before we launched the Transformers book just lurking on like the big Transformer fan sites just to see what people were saying about the comics, like the Dreamwave series, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they hoped for in Transformer comics, just to get a sense of, not to do what they said they wanted because everybody's got a different opinion,
Sure.
but just to get a sense of like what worked, what didn't work, and why these things didn't work. And so it was like this whole crash course in just studying like the fandom side of things and trying to understand like how to best make a book that is going to appeal to these hardcore fans, because those are the ones who stick with you. And so I certainly didn't want to launch a thing that, Transformers have been out of market for months or a year or something like that. And you don't want to come out, and have that fan base really anticipating a new Transformers series and have it fall flat. I mean, it did fall flat for some people because you're never going to please everybody. And we didn't have giant Transformers in issue one. We had them in disguise and tried to do the slow build. But I don't, people don't necessarily want a slow build with Transformers comics the way they tolerate it with like Ultimate Spider-Man or something.
Right. Right. Although they may say they want a slow build, and when you give it to them, they're like, "Oh wait, I didn't want that."
Yeah, yeah. So, and there's bits of course correction here and there. Like we kept it very grounded on Earth for the first year, staying fully away from Cybertron. And then there was a whole contingent of fans that were like, why the hell aren't they on Cybertron? Like you're missing out on. So, then we do a series that's just Cybertron focused. So you do a little bits of market research and course correcting along the way.
Yeah, understandable. It seems like you also had, and I don't know if you draw a distinction here, but I was going to say skin in the game because you wrote a number of series that were would they, I guess they're licensed properties, but they're adaptations too. So I'm not sure if you would consider something that's not long running, that's more of a mini series, an adaptation or license or both. But like things like Shaun of the Dead, and you did Land of the Dead, I think, Beowulf.
Yeah, if there was an
And
Of the
Clive
Dead, I
Barker.
think Steve Niles did the first Of the Dead. He did the original Dawn of the Dead adaptation. And then yeah, I did that Land of the Dead with Ramiro. I always wanted to write comics, but I also was wary of taking opportunities from freelancers. And so when I would write stuff internally, it was often things that like we had to protect a script, or there were NDAs with the studio where you couldn't necessarily hire freelance talent as easily. And so then I would do stuff like that, like those two things, like the Beowulf. Gabriel Rodriguez and I adapted that from the Neil Gaiman, Robert Zemeckis like animated movie. Um, and then I did a Transformers movie prequel, which I co-wrote that with Simon Furman, but again, sort of kept that mostly in house because there was such a crazy blanket of secrecy on that movie that we just couldn't. You almost had to keep it in house. So yeah, I would do those where I could and when I could.
Uh, what did you like about that style of writing in terms of adaptation? We've talked to a number of writers who uh, really enjoy, not necessarily working from a completely blank page and putting sort of their spin, if you will, or just taking it from one form to another. And then some that are like, I can't do that, or I feel like I'm stepping on toes. What was your thoughts about adaptation in general?
Well, some of them, yeah, it's funny. Some of them you get no flexibility, and it's just like you have to totally adhere to the script. You have to totally adhere to the film. And when I was a kid, adaptations were great because that's all you could see. You didn't necessarily have, I don't know, easy access to just streaming them or watching them at home. And so it was like the adaptation was the way you could experience Star Wars again. Um, but like when we were doing adaptations at IDW, it was like, well, the movie exists and you can watch it all the time. So I don't know. You tried to make them something different than just the movie, whether that was adding in scenes, if there were things that were deleted from the original movie, trying to find ways to add that in, just doing things that tried to make it less of just a film on paper and make it sort of its own thing. And some work better than others. Like I honestly think Beowulf, the graphic novel, is so much better than the movie. The movie just didn't entirely work for me. I thought it was part of that early motion capture CGI
Yeah.
thing, and I just thought Gabriel's art in the comic was so much more beautiful than the film itself. And so sometimes they work better. Sometimes they're just there as a companion. And it's funny because I'm still doing that now. Like I don't want to jump ahead too far, but I'm doing that with Francis Coppola around his new movie, doing a version of the movie as a graphic novel. So I enjoy it. Like I enjoy finding the things that work really well in comics, because you can't really just translate it one to one. So you have to make it a good comic reading experience all on its own. And so I find that more freeing with novels and short stories than I do movies. But I've done all of those, and yeah, there's usually something fun in all of them. Sometimes it's just working with a great artist who makes it look really cool.
Yeah. I find that whole process fascinating, and as I said, there are some out there that just it's like their bread and butter. Like P. Craig Russell
Oh
is
my God, yeah.
always doing adaptation, phenomenal
They're
adaptations.
beautiful.
It's
I
like
know.
bringing out things from like the original material
Yeah.
that you didn't know were there, or putting a little more, I don't know, highlight on this thing versus what you would normally get in a novel or a movie. So,
Well,
um,
like I adapted a Clive Barker novel, The Great and Secret
right.
Show, and Clive's books are very sort of esoteric and internal. And so when there's monsters and things going on in his books, he doesn't necessarily describe them. So he wants everybody to kind of form their own visual of what they're seeing in their mind's eye when they read, which is great as a reader. But to go adapting that, I was like, hey, Clive, what are these supposed to look like? He goes, it's your book. You make it your thing. And so then you're like, all right, well, I need to now define this thing visually and hope I don't let the fan base who's been reading this book for the last 15 years, and having their own version of what this thing is supposed to look like in their head feel disappointed by what we did. And I mean, I think it worked fine, but yeah, you do feel there's bits of feeling presumptuous along the way where you're like, I don't know, that or editing out scenes where you're like, well, this scene doesn't need to be here. You're like, who am I to say that this Clive Barker or Stephen King scene doesn't need to be in this adaptation? But you got to also be true to what the form is. And so just to adapt something like straight through doesn't really serve that form all that well. So you got to kind of get over feeling presumptuous.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. I want to ask, I was going to ask about your, creator-owned comics, which I'd love to get to, but just based on this whole, theme of adaptation, how do you adapt or how do you do an adaptation of a band? Because you did a lot of books on Kiss, and obviously, out of any band, you would probably think that would be the most the most open to sort of interpretation with the costumes and the production and everything else. But just if you could talk a little bit about, what you were thinking with Kiss as a property and how to develop that as a comic.
Yeah, so my older brother got me into two things when I was a kid. One was comic books, the other was the band Kiss. And then Marvel did these Kiss magazines, like these magazine sized comics back in the day. So I remember reading those, and I don't know, I was always just like, I want to do that. I want to like, you basically spend your entire like working career in comics trying to please like your 10-year-old self.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, as a kid, I would love to think about writing a Kiss comic. And so when the chance came up, like we'd been working with Gene Simmons on some other things. He said, why don't you take on a full Kiss license? I'm like, yes, and I need to write that because, that'll make childhood me happy. And so it was like, I just filled the comics with jokes is the wrong word, but like in jokes and references, and like every character was named after a song of theirs, and there were circumstances that were based on lyrics. And so it was just like, hopefully it was a coherent story for people that didn't care about the band. But if you were like steeped in their music, almost every page you're like, oh, I know that reference. I get that. I get that. And so I just spent a lot of time doing that, was like, I don't know, using visuals from the old albums and references from the old albums, and just like I said, trying to please me and my older brother.
I thought there would be something like that. You have to be just like you were saying in the beginning. You have to have some attachment and passion for the material in order to, make something that reflects that on the page. So
I did a one shot that was like Mars Attacks Kiss. We were doing these crossovers of Mars Attacks with
right.
different IDW characters. And I just completely retold the Marvel comic story from the 70s, like, but with Mars Attacks and Kiss, because again, like just trying to pull forward all of that stuff that I experienced as a little kid. And so, yeah, I mean, it was ridiculous, but it was a lot of fun. I will say, like, while we're talking licensed comics, can I come clean on one thing? Like, I need
Yeah,
to unburden my soul.
please.
I screwed up the ending of Shaun of the Dead. I had 4 issues, which at the time was 22-page comics, so I had 88 pages to adapt the screenplay, and like the dialogue in that movie is so much fun, and so I didn't want to cheat any of the bits of dialogue, and so there's a lot of pages of talking heads that artist Zach Howard made look great, but we got to the end and I just didn't pace it right. And so at the end scene when they're at the Winchester pub and the military comes in and is shooting all the zombies, and it's kind of a big like climactic scene when they save everybody right when you think they're all going to die. It's like 2 panels in the comic because I ran out of space, and I'm like, well, I don't want to cut any of the cool talky stuff. So sorry, military scene, but so it ends pretty abruptly compared to the rest of it, because I just like I was new to writing comics and adapting comics, and so I just didn't quite pace the entire thing out over all 4 issues. I like adapted one at a time and should have thought about the long form. So yeah, when I look at that last page or two, I'm just like, oops.
Um, I cannot accept the apology on behalf of
Right,
fandom,
right.
but noted, and hopefully it was not actually very much noted by the greater reading public, but I'm
And
sure
Edgar
everything
loved it. Like
else.
Edgar loved the adaptation. He bought all the artwork except for the pages that I have, and
Well,
so
really,
yeah, he was a
that's what you should lean on
yeah, yeah,
rather than
yeah. I
the
just always felt bad that like I read, the big action scene doesn't get any play in the comic, but
yeah.
all the cool dialogue bits do, which I think is more important in that movie.
Good, good, good. Um, well, thank you. I'm glad, your soul should be lifted.
Yeah,
It's off your
yeah,
chest,
yeah.
and we can move on. Um, so I did want to get over, you did reference the crossovers, which I want to talk about as
Mm.
well. But I did want to get to some of your creator-owned comics and talk about, where do your stories come from? Let me just list off some of them. Zombies versus Robots, which is probably the most prominent, has, had several iterations. Groom
Yeah.
Lake, The Colonized, The Hollows. Um, are all of these just come out of do you have a book of story ideas? Are you writing down dreams? Is it just collaborations with artists? You're like, what about just riffing on stuff? How do these all come about? And is it different from project to project?
It's kind of little parts of all of those things. So Zombies versus Robots came about because Ashley Wood, who's toy designer, painter, comic book artist, I find his stuff just so unique and beautiful.
Yeah.
He lives in Australia, but he was in IDW's offices for a while in like 2005. He was doing bits of the CSI comic, like the flashback or crime scenes or what have you. And he goes, "Hey, why don't you write me a book? Let's do a book together." And I go, "All right, well, what do you like to draw?" And he goes, "Robots and zombies." So then we're like, "All right, well, what's the stupidest thing we can come up with?" Because it really makes no like the whole point was to make a comic that didn't seem Hollywoodable. Because at that point, it was like early on when Hollywood was kind of optioning everything and nothing was getting made, and you could tell people were like sort of doing comics that just felt like pitches. So like, let's do a comic that is completely unfilmable. So it's zombies versus robots, which makes no sense. Like zombies need brains to live. There are no brains because there's just robots left on the planet. There's no character arcs because they're both just like these automatons with either programmed, missions like the robots have, or zombies are pretty mindless. And so it was like all these different elements that we thought just don't sort of follow your usual story, your three acts and your character arcs and all that. So like we were completely enamored a few years later when Sony's like, we want to try to make that. We're like, good luck. But so it sort of always follows like just stuff I like. Like Room Lake was I'm a bit of a UFO nerd, and so I would pull in things that were like I don't want to say real, like it's very air quoted when you say real, but like all the stories you hear about like real sightings and aliens and bases and things like that. So kind of like with Kiss referencing things in their songs, this is like me referencing like sort of some of the real reports about aliens and things over the years and just trying to have fun with it. The original story was a bit more serious. Then Ben Templesmith came in to draw it. He goes, "Oh man, let's have more fun with this. Like, let's make it wild and a bit more crazy." I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So we, just sort of had fun with it. And almost everything I've done involves some form of robot or cyborg or alien or zombie. And so there's kind of this through line through everything I do that has some of those elements in there.
And that's just those are well, I don't know if you call them, I guess they're genres, right? Or in general, they'll call in Hollywood, they'll just call that is genre sort of
Yeah,
material.
yeah. It's all
Um,
genre material. I mean, the thing I did the thing recently called Dreamweaver, which was it was kind of playing off the old Green Lantern story of the dying or aging hero bequeaths the powers to somebody younger, and in this case, it was more of like a guy who realizes he's too old to be doing this. He hands off the powers to somebody younger, and then when she gets better at it than he is, then he decides he wants the powers back. So it's kind of like the Green Lantern story, but with a heel turn. But it's way more like serious, as far as just like I don't know the older characters like trying to wonder if he still has a place in the world. Like it's not as much of a smart assy kind of thing as some of the earlier stuff that I've done, which is I guess what happens. You try to change your tones along the way and just not do the same exact thing over and over.
Yeah, probably your life also, plays out. You
Yeah.
get older, and maybe your perspective shifts a little
Well,
bit.
I did write that. Like, I mean, I started it when I was at IDW, but I didn't feel equipped to write it till I was sort of sidelined there. So then it was like, all right, well, do I still have a place in comics? Let me work out my demons through this story instead. So yes, very much so.
And you seem to be balancing, in fact, going forward from your earlier work, both the, whole cloth creator owned books, but also continuing to do adaptations. Do you like sort of, flexing both muscles and keeping those, both going strong as you go forward?
Yeah, because I mean, there's a number of comics of my own that I want to do, but not just an endless amount just for the sake of doing them. So I'm trying to be very like smart about the ones that I pick for myself or the ones that I do with artists who want to work together, and then there's time to fill those gaps in with I don't know, adaptations or just collaborating with people that I really like. And so I love that too. Like I just kind of love all of it. So whatever, whether it's comic based on a license or an adaptation or my own thing, like it's all just sort of the act of making comics, which is the thing that I think I still love as much now as I ever did.
Awesome. Well, let's swing back to the crossovers. You mentioned one of them. There was a big one in 2011 called Infestation, which let me see if I get everybody that was in there: Transformers, Star Trek, Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe, and your Zombies versus
Yeah.
Robots. Um, First of all, how do these crossovers work? Especially, are they all from the same licensors? And if they aren't, which I don't think all of them are, but how do you, what is the juggling act like to make sure everybody's okay with those characters interacting with other characters, possibly from different universes, and everybody's sort of getting along?
It was such a nightmare. I have to say, like, so I started working on the infestation thing at least a year, probably a year and a half before that. And by working on, it, I mean just trying to convince the licensors to let us like bring these different characters into a big event because at the time that's when zombie stuff was selling really well. So we're like, oh, well, let's do a big event book involving zombies. And so since I had zombies versus robots, and within the architecture of that story, there's like a interdimensional gateway, so it sort of made it easy for characters to universe hop or what have you.
Right.
But it took a year for like the Star Trek people and the Ghostbusters people and the Hasbro people to all yeah, some fell in line or came around sooner than others, but like to get everybody on board with these characters kind of interacting took a really long time because they go, well, why would we want to? I mean, frankly, some of it comes down to split royalties. It's like, well, if you just did a Transformers comic, we make all the money on that. But if you do a thing where we have to now count the pages that our characters appear versus Star Trek versus Ghostbusters, what have you, then suddenly we're all doing these percentages of the whole, and it doesn't make as much financial sense, which drives part of the main part of the licensing business. And so you spend a year convincing them that sometimes doing stuff for fun is the right reason. Um, so it took a while. And then even once the crossover started, it was like, okay, well, they can all exist in the storyline, but they can't meet. So Transformers and GI Joe were okay because they were both Hasbro, but like we had to sort of sideline all the different characters, and so Ghostbusters could interact with zombies, but not with Star Trek, and so it was like our first step into a larger world of doing intercompany crossovers. The next time we did it, everybody kind of got it a bit more, and so then they were willing to let their characters interact with one another to a greater degree. But yeah, that first one it was like a proving ground and a real long uphill slog of just trying to convince everybody why this was good for their different brands.
Yeah, I can imagine. So it seems like it was, well, it's the money. It's always the money, in some when it comes down to it. But you know, I guess were there licensors that are more protective of their IP than others? And how do you convince someone to sort of open their guard and play nice with others?
I mean, it's sort of the same way you convince other licensors to bring their titles to IDW was like they see we could show them that we didn't break Transformers. We did a good job and the fans liked it and everything. And so then like Star Trek would feel better about bringing their license here. So it's kind of the same. Like Infestation went well, didn't hurt anybody. The comic went over fine. Um, and so then next time they're a bit more open. There are always some who there are some who have said, well, no, we can't have our character interacting with those because those characters are fictional and ours is real. Like, no. The giant lizard breathing fire is also fictional. But there was some of that, like we couldn't have that character crossover with some of
Right.
the others because they just in their mind, their canon is that character exists in its own universe and there's no penetrating that bubble. But I don't know. I think eventually most of them come around because they see that they go over well with the fans. They often see a boost in sales and they make all the properties look good. And, the fans liking the stuff and feeling good about these characters is kind of why you do all of this. And so mostly they come around, but every now and then there are holdouts who just won't allow it. But, going forward, it just feels like I don't know. There have been so many crossovers and stuff lately that it now nothing surprises me. So now when Wolverine and Predator team up in a series, they're like, well, yeah, of course that was going to happen.
Right.
Um, like Darth Vader will probably be in the Marvel universe at some point, and so inevitably all of these things are just going to exist in one universe. But until then, yeah, we just try to, just try to do right by them and not and take all of them seriously. The one thing that always drove me crazy was when you do the big crossovers with like, I don't know, uh, Transformers and let's say Ninja Turtles, even though I would you sometimes have to make sure that both sides get equal play. And so
Mm,
whenever they fight, it's kind of like when there was a Marvel DC crossover, like nobody can win the fight. It's like
yeah.
everybody has to get their shots in and like, well, that's not a very interesting story if you can't sort of just tell a story where there's a winner and a loser and stuff like that. But I get it. But there's sometimes that overprotectiveness that hinders the actual story from working well.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember during that Marvel and DC crossover, I think it was Ron Mars that was telling us that um, I think for the main matchups, they had fans vote as to who would win, and they actually had, I think, final panels of the battle where
Mm.
one person was walking away or one character was walking away and the other, and it just so happened that it like evened out by the voting
Oh
that it was
yeah,
like
yeah.
four Marvel would win, four DC would win. But yeah, I mean that's the kind of balance you have to
And
sort
you
of
can't let the
strike.
fans vote. The fans voted to kill Robin years ago. Like the fans don't
Right.
always make the right moves.
What do the fans know? But yeah, it's got to be a little bit strange and trying to please everybody, including the fans, for the
There's a lot
project.
of that, yeah, of just trying to make sure that you don't hurt the characters, even though these stories never hurt the characters,
Right.
but trying to come because like the story people, the editorial people at like Hasbro and stuff were amazing. They were so good about just letting us try everything, but then you get to the different levels of the company who don't necessarily engage with the details to the same degree, and so they're the ones who are like, no, that doesn't make sense. Don't do that, but without actually sort of hearing how the details might play out. And so you run into that at times too, or you need to rely on like the publishing people there to help you plead your case because often us as the licensee, what we weren't going to get full say, so we needed a champion internally there to sort of help see these things through.
Makes sense. So, one property that you got to play with among many others, but not at IDW, if I'm getting this correct, is ROM, right? In
That,
2016, is that
yeah,
right?
no, that was actually at IDW first.
Oh,
Well, not
okay.
first. And it's another one of those where there's times I look back and I'm like, did I really need to spend 10 years of my life chasing the ROM rights? And I did, obviously. But
Sure.
yeah, it was one where they couldn't figure out like the Marvel and the Hasbro of it all, like who owned what parts. And I did a ton of research on like which characters belong to which company, but legally they needed to suss out all of that. And so finally, it was right after I did this book called Onyx, which was totally just a ROM knockoff. I mean, let's be honest, it was just like at a certain point, I was like, I'm never going to get to write ROM, so I'll just write a ROM-like kind of title. And then right when that book launched, Hasbro contacted me and said, "Hey, you know what? You can do ROM." Um, and so it did. I started asking about it in like 2006, and we launched it in 2016. So it took some time. And I mean, I had a blast with it. I got to write with Christos Gage, who I love. The fans wanted the Marvel universe behind the characters, and I get it because that's what made a lot of those early stories matter so much, was like the universe of it all, not just the character himself. Um, but yeah, I wish it could have gone longer. Like we had fun with it, and so I don't know. It's one of those characters that I just always loved. And so when Marvel asked me, just a couple years ago to write the intros for their omnibus collections, like I loved just that I could feel sort of even more cemented with the character.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's part of your, little pocket of interest, right? Anything robot, anything cyborg,
Oh,
or
yeah,
anything,
absolutely. And
that,
I'm sure that's what started it. Yeah.
yeah, ROM certainly fits that bill. So yeah, I'm glad you were sort of finally able to get to it, because I can imagine that was something, as you said, it was sort of incubating for like 10 years before it was able to
Yeah.
come out.
And there were a couple near starts. Like there were some where I went and got a commission cover. I'm sorry, a cover commissioned by Sal Buscema, who was the original artist on ROM at Marvel. And we were about to run it, and they go, no, no, you can't do that. And then we got some pages drawn of Rom appearing in one of the Transformers titles because that's how we were going to launch him. And then they said, no, no, you can't do that. And so it was like there were a few stop starts, but eventually, we got it out there.
Right. So before we move on to kind of post IDW, I'd love to know, we tried to get through a decent amount here, and I think we touched on a lot, but were there any books or properties or ongoing series, just projects you worked on while you were there that um, maybe don't crop up as much in these kind of conversations, things that you thought were really great, but somehow maybe not slipped through the cracks, but didn't get the attention you think they deserve? What would those be?
No, it's a great question. I have two that are always in my mind. And one is we launched Judge Dredd. We brought Judge Dredd back to America. I think we were the first publisher since DC tried it. And the Judge Dredd fans, like the UK fans, are very resistant to American creators tackling it because it's always such a British property, and always
Right.
has been. And I know that some of the earlier attempts didn't necessarily work the way they wanted. And so they were initially resistant to IDW taking it on, but I brought in Dwayne Swarzinski, who I just think is an amazing writer. And Nelson Daniel was the artist. And I just thought that book was great. And it just, and people that read it liked it, but I just don't think it got given a full shot because it was, Judge Dredd by non-English creators. And so yeah, I don't know. I think that one just never quite broke through the way I thought it deserved to because I
Hmm.
I just found the stories and the art so much fun. And then another one was when we were first launching Godzilla. Like on paper, I was just like, this cannot miss. Like we brought in Eric Powell to write the book, and then Phil Hester was going to draw it. And like I love both of those guys. Eric Powell just seemed like the perfect guy to write a Godzilla book after the Goon. Like, he can do big action and humor and just like all these things that I just thought would make a great book. And for some reason, that book just didn't land for people. And I
Mm.
don't know what it was. And I mean, and sometimes that's just kind of the art of making comics, is like sometimes things just don't work and you don't know why. And it's like not because of, I don't know, the fans or the creators or anything that went wrong necessarily. The timing wasn't right. The fans didn't want that version of Godzilla when it launched. Like, you never know, and sometimes you'll read stuff years later and be like, oh my God, this is so much better than I remembered it. Like Kevin Smith's Green Arrow book. I think that book is great. When I first read it, I didn't entirely get what he wanted to do with it. And so, yeah, I don't, it's one of those things I like ponder sometimes. Like, why didn't Eric Powell and Phil Hester on a Godzilla book become one of the best? And we had an Alex Ross cover. Like, that book should have sold great, and it just
Right.
didn't really launch. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm puzzled and just fascinated by these things.
Sometimes it's the randomly it's the timing,
Yeah.
right? When was that? When was the Godzilla book?
God, I don't remember. I maybe 2012, something like that.
Hmm. I
It was
I wonder
before the
if you brought it
movies.
out now or in the past. Well, certainly now, and maybe I was going to say the past couple of years. With there's just been more and more interest, at least more and more projects from Hollywood, of course, but
Yeah. Yeah.
around Godzilla and Godzilla minus one and all that stuff that's just well received and sort of reignited some interest. If that just sort of all comes together, it's just sort of the right time even
Yeah.
if it's a quality book, if it's for whatever reason it's not the right time, if it's ahead of its time or what have you, these things don't hit. But yeah, I mean, your calculus seems to all lead towards it being a big book, and I am surprised that it didn't sort of catch on. So maybe
And I
people go
think
back
you're
after this and look
yeah, but I
for it.
think you're spot on about the oh wait, I'm sorry, were you?
No, I was just saying maybe after this people go back and look for it, especially
Oh, I
with
thought you
the
said I
renewed
thought you said
interest.
we'll be back right after this. I'm like, we're doing commercial breaks. How
Oh no,
cool.
no, no. Well, I wish. You got
Yeah,
people that want to sponsor us.
but no, I think you're spot on about the timing of it, because there are things that would come out 20 years ago or something. I'll read, like, they'll do a new edition of it, or they'll Kickstarter a deluxe edition, and I'll read and be like, "My God, this is great! Why didn't anybody really talk about it?" And so, yeah, it's just that's kind of the fun and the challenge of this is like how to do it well, how to do it consistently, and how to do it at the right time when it's going to land for people.
Right. Totally agree. Okay, so in 2018, you left IDW the first time.
Yeah.
I'd love to know a little bit about the chronology, but was there something at that time? Was it an offer from Skybound, or was it something at that time after being, at IDW for so long that felt like the right time to move on?
I mean, I think I probably could have stayed, but I would have had to sort of go along with some directional changes in the company that I didn't necessarily feel were the right ones, and I'd been there long enough to sort of either become convinced of my own bullshit. I was like, well, I think I've got a good handle on what the company should be doing. And when certain parts of the company wanted to pivot to this, and it's not my company, and at that point the owners were in the midst of leaving, and so there was kind of a new regime coming in. I just felt like I'm not the right guy to change the company in the directions that they intended. So I was like, well, I'll move on. And at the time, like, Skybound did make a nice offer to come join them, and I mean, I love those guys. I think Kirkman and Dave Alpert are running a great company, and like, and now, I mean, they're eclipsing anything we ever did with the Hasbro properties with their Energon universe. Like, they're just a good group of people over there. And so it just felt like, yeah, maybe just a change of scenery, and a break from all of this after, I was like probably almost 15 years at that time.
Yeah.
Just felt like a good time to try something new and different.
Yeah, I mean that sounds like the right decision to me. Um, uh, but you didn't stay for very
I
long,
was gonna
right?
say, and then plot twist, yeah.
um, uh, uh, just curious, like what was the reasoning behind that? I mean, IDW is sort of like we made a big mistake. The direction that you weren't maybe in agreement was like, oops. Would you love to come back? Is that sort of the gist of it, or was it something
Yeah, I
maybe a
mean,
little
so there were
different?
a couple things. One was like I was brought into Skybound to help launch a licensed comic division. And I
Okay.
mean, that stuff is slow going, like I said, I chased ROM for 10 years. And so I was there, like, it was working up to a year, and I hadn't really accomplished anything. And so I just kind of felt like, I don't know, I just felt like I had failed at the goal that I'd set for myself to, like, bring them some key properties. And sometimes they're under a longer contract, and so you can't make things happen sooner. But I think I just got antsy about not fulfilling what I had told them I'd be able to do in the amount of time that I had hoped to do it. And at that point, yeah, IDW called and said, "Hey, we screwed up. We should have listened to you. our mistake. We want you to come back and run the show. And there was something flattering to that. And there was something sort of unfinished business
Hmm.
about all of it that just felt like, I don't know, like them admitting that they probably should have listened the first time sort of felt like, all right, I should give this another go and see if I can sort of move it back in the direction that seems, you know, that I would have liked it to go.
Right.
And then ultimately, I was there for about a year and a half, and it was just like, well, it's still kind of the same structure. You when it's not your company, you still can only accomplish what you're able to accomplish. And so, yeah, just early on in the pandemic, when it became a thing of like, the job had changed beyond what I wanted to be doing in comics, like a lot more management of budgets and people and overhead and the non-making of comics to the same
Right.
degree. And that was the stuff that I always felt like I was good at and loved doing. And so I was just like, all right, I'm going to now step aside for good. So
Yeah. Well, maybe it's you were able to write your own ending, maybe, which is what you didn't get to do when you felt like, you were sort of
completely. Yeah.
forced to go into a different direction, or the company was going in a different direction from you. So, so I guess, I mean, hopefully that was, at least sort of a fulfilling cap to, what was a long career at, one place. So,
Yeah, and I mean
um,
it's all like a no fault kind of thing, like I get
right.
that companies need to go in the direction they think is best for them, and by that token I need to also do what I thought was best for me. And so yeah, I just felt like that it was time to just strike out and then I don't know, figure out what's next. And so that's
Yeah.
where then Image very kindly called and said, "Hey, if you want to launch an imprint here, we'd love to have you."
Oh, great. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was like Eric Stevenson reached out and just said, we know what you do, we like what you do, you're good at what you do, and so we trust what you do, and if you'd like to, bring whatever you plan to do next here, like we'd love to carve out some space for you, and so that was great, and so yeah, Ash and I we'd kind of been talking before about partnering to a greater degree and doing more things together. And so this just kind of became the right time to launch the company. And Ash loves weird names. And so he was like, let's call it Syzygy. I'm like, but nobody can spell that or pronounce it or define it. And he goes, yeah, yeah, that's why I like it. And so that's what we went with was Syzygy. Despite all the people going, I don't know if that's the name you should go with. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, creative to the bone, right? Like no commercial.
But I liked it
uh,
because it's sort of a cosmic term that involves like celestial bodies, sort of like I don't know, in each other's orbit, making each other stronger, that kind of thing. So I could at least apply it to the definition of like partnership or collaboration. And
right.
so I came around on it in that way because I'm like I at least need the name to make sense for me.
Yeah. I mean, the name is cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would sort of as I guess someone with maybe a business background might certainly balk at it in just in terms of like commercial viability and being able to,
Oh yeah, they'd
use
be
it
like,
going down the
Top
line.
Cow, Dark Horse, Image, like those are really easy to pronounce and remember, and you didn't
Right.
pick anything like that. So so here
So
we
tell
are.
us what's going on right now, what's coming up in the world of Syzygy, and what do you have on your plate? What do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, so I mean, I wanted it all along to be kind of like a mini IDW where it wouldn't just be our stuff, but I wanted to keep working with people that I like working with. So we launched with the Joe Hill series, Rain,
Mhm.
um, and I sort of feel like these dual responsibilities working in comics, where I either want to employ people that I loved as a kid just to kind of give back to them for all the joy they gave me, but also help like cultivate new talents and help bring new people into comics. And so doing a book with Joe and then working with David Boer and Zoe Thorogood on it sort of helped me do all of that. I love working with Joe. I think Zoe is this amazing talent and she's kind of continued to prove that over and over again since doing Rain. And so that just felt like the right kind of book to sum up like what Syzygy is, which is, just trying not to do the exact same things you might see at five other publishers. It's not easy when people ask me like how to pitch or what I'm looking for. It's look at rain, like that kind of thing, like something that's kind of has a more idiosyncratic look or feel to it that, like I say, isn't just the usual kind of pitch that you might see anywhere. So then Ash and I are doing stuff. We've done a handful of books with other people, about to launch a book with Owen King and Jesse Kellerman, who are both novelists. They're doing this really fun crime series called Self Help that launches this month. So yeah, just trying to, keep doing all kinds of books, and some collected editions of stuff that I brought with me from IDW, just bringing things back into print, just trying to keep having fun making books.
Awesome. Living the dream.
Sometimes, I mean, it's a hell of a lot harder as a largely a solo act, doing this stuff.
Yeah.
But it also has opened up these crazy opportunities where Francis Ford Coppola reaches out to me out of the blue and says, "Hey, will you help me make a graphic novel?" And doing this stuff, I was then able to set up some books at Simon and Schuster and Abrams Comic Arts, and those are books that are like new editions of books that I loved as a kid. So I'm still able to fulfill that part of what I want to, which is just to, keep making 10-year-old me happy. And so yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge in a lot of ways that I didn't expect and haven't experienced in the last 15 plus years, but it's also been freeing. And so it's all of those things, which is kind of how everybody sums up comic market in 2024 in general, I think.
That's for sure. It's a wild place. Can be very fulfilling, but also very challenging, and you don't know where it's going to go next. But it sounds like you have all the ingredients, and you're getting calls like from Francis Ford Coppola. Is that for Megalopolis?
Megalopolis, yeah.
Yeah.
And then when you mentioned, like when you asked earlier about books that kind of flew under the radar, God, we did this book just 2 years ago with writer Alex Packnadel and artist Casper Wingard, called
Okay.
All Against All, and it's kind of a alien versus predator story, but the alien is like Tarzan, sort of the last surviving human,
Okay.
or the predator, anyways, the last surviving human who's like this Tarzan figure. It's an amazing book. It's so thoughtful and smart and like gorgeous, and it is one that also just kind of flew a bit more under the radar than I would have liked, because I think both those guys are just immense talents. And I think that's when people come to it, they're gonna really see just how smart and good those two are together. I mean, and separately too, they've been doing great stuff. So
Very cool. It's called All Against All.
All Against All, yeah, we were originally going to call it Apex, like Apex Predator, but then
Uh,
there's a lot of games and books and movies called Apex, so had to be a little bit, different.
yeah, and you couldn't call it Predator.
Yeah, right.
All right, Banditos, what did you think? I enjoyed talking to Chris, as I do all of our guests, but I really loved hearing about kind of his origin story, how he came to where he was at IDW, and then what he did once he was there and working with all of these licensed properties, and then doing a lot of his original work. Now it's on to new projects, bigger and better. And so we wish Chris all the luck in the world and thank him for being on the program. I wanted to again remind everybody CBC Awards. The cbcawards.org is where you need to go to vote for the Dollar Bin Bandits in the first couple of categories. This is a YouTube Comics award show or nomination process, and we'd love if you can throw a vote towards the Dollar Bin Bandits. So you have until October 19th to do that. We would appreciate it. And we also appreciate when you rate, review, subscribe. I should have said say it all together because you guys must know it by now. It really helps us, though. We want to keep this great interview train running. And so any support you can lend to this little podcast would be appreciated. But that'll do it for this episode. There's another one coming up on Friday. So we'll see you then.